3 minutes after 10 is the time. It's a funny one, isn't it? You look at the nature of reportage, and I'm not ordinarily one for particularly where the BBC is concerned. I think they've got a whole heap of problems. But generally speaking, they do their best in a very bad situation. But you look at the reportage, the nature of the reporting, and it's impossible to avoid at least the suspicion that this so-called prisons crisis, and you'll understand in a moment why I use the phrase so-called, there is a prisons crisis, is not new. It was under the last government that prisons reached breaking point. We know that 10,000 people were released earlier than they would ordinarily have been, and we know that Rishi Sunak was warned during the election campaign. I'll say that again. During the election campaign, that he would need to do precisely what the government is now doing in order to avoid an actual overflow. Now, I am conscious that we all, in a way, suffer from the footballification of politics. Well, maybe that's not fair. Maybe you don't, actually. But I think I do. I certainly suffer from it. I also suffer from a form of benign patriotism, whereby even if a politician who I have enormous problems with ends up in power, I kind of want them to do well for reasons of the national interest. You'll remember the 2.5 hours where I was optimistic about the prospect of Rishi Sunak turning the oil tanker around before he put Suella Braverman back in the Home Office, and we realised that it was grim and dismal business as usual. But I make no apology for that 2.5 hours of optimism. I want the country to get better, and if you look, as we often do on the programme during our time together, you look at all the things that we consider to be in dire need of improvement, mostly things that have declined or diminished or gone off a cliff since 2010. Yesterday we were talking about the NHS, of course. Patient satisfaction in the NHS was the highest on record in 2010. And the prison service has similarly suffered during the 14 years of Tory rule. But bizarrely, and this is why I mentioned from the outset that I don't normally like the kind of the tiny corners of the media that are thankfully free of carefully cultivated opinion. When they take a kicking for apparently being biased, it gives me pause. It sticks in my craw a bit. But I don't think anyone can argue that the BBC's reporting of the prison crisis under a government that is trying to fix the mess made by the government that actually caused the prison crisis is a little bit imbalanced. Not just the BBC, Sky. We may be guilty, I don't know. But the idea that there's anything that links the current government to the crisis in prisons that they are trying to fix is palpably absurd. And yet, maybe I'm reading it wrong. Maybe you're seeing it differently. It's sort of halfway around the world, this idea, before the truth has even got its trousers on. And that's why today I find it odd that we once again turn our attention to a prisons crisis as if it is a story that is being viewed exclusively through the lens of the current government. And it means that the current government is charged with looking at things that the last government was reluctant to do. Again, things I don't like to believe, but the evidence kind of puts me in a position where I have to. Things I don't like to believe would include the idea that the last, and this is naive, I think, that the last government did deliberately leave a hell of a lot of problems in the in-tray that they could have actually dealt with themselves. In the context of prisons, I think that's impossible to argue with. Maybe they didn't know quite how many of their ships would come in on this, because the idea that you'd take a crisis caused by Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and David Cameron and somehow seek to portray it as a crisis caused by Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper and Angela Rayner, they probably didn't know it would be quite that bonkers, in much the same way that they didn't think that much of the British media would come after them for obeying rules in the same way, or even more viciously than they went after people like Boris Johnson for actively breaking rules. Labour politicians getting into trouble for declaring things, while Tory politicians were routinely being excused for not declaring things. The imbalance here is bonkers. But I say again, I almost certainly suffer from a mild form of footballification, so maybe I'm seeing that wrong. But you can't, I don't think, argue with the idea that there was a conscious decision when Rishi Sunak elected to ignore warnings from his own prisons minister about what was happening in prisons. There was a conscious decision to let the next lot deal with this disaster, let the next lot deal with this crisis. If you want to pick a hole in that theory, you absolutely can. 0345 6060973 is the number you need. It was clearly a matter of choice to leave this for the next lot to deal with, and then as the next lot bring themselves to try to deal with it, they stand accused either explicitly or implicitly of being responsible for the mess that they're trying to clear up. But it still needs to be cleared up. Criminals could serve their time at home under court's shake-up. Offenders to face house arrest instead of prison. A few stories that speak to, if you like, new ideas or newish ideas. Most sentences under 6 months may be scrapped. That's something reportedly being considered by the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, and her colleagues. David Gauke, this is a good appointment, right? This is the opposite of footballification. David Gauke, Conservative Minister, appointed to look into a sentencing review, former Justice Secretary. That is a good appointment. Listen, come here a minute. This is what it sounds like, all right? This is what the opposite of footballification sounds like. David Gauke is a Tory. He's been appointed by a Labour Prime Minister. I think that's a good appointment. So, hang on. That doesn't. How can he be biased? Well, it's a good appointment of a sensible politician to undertake a necessary review of an urgent issue. You can even leave out in that analysis who was responsible for the issue. So extraordinary, isn't it? When you actually see what's going on under your nose and manage to shrug off these invitations to be angry or insulting, it's a good appointment. Time will tell whether or not he produces the goods. But he has already said the reoffending rate for those who have been in prison for a short amount of time is much higher than for those who served a community sentence. And that is an interesting starting point for this conversation. The reoffending rate for those who have been in prison for a short amount of time is much higher than for those who served a community sentence. So I say to you, is there any point sending people to prison for let's say, under 6 months? I'm going to use the word under because I can't quite remember whether it's fewer or less or whether you're allowed to say both. I think it's fewer, but under is better. Most sentences under 6 months may be scrapped. So I say to you, is there any point in doing it? And you might respond to me by saying yes, because actions must have consequences. So there's two problems there immediately. Number one, we don't see a community sentence as meaningful. We don't see it as satisfactory. So what is it? What impulse is being left unsatisfied by a community sentence? We don't think it hurts enough, do we? That's the problem. We think you'll be painting over graffiti outside the local train station, or you'll be picking up litter or something like that. A community sentence. And I'm not necessarily lumping you immediately into the sort of hang 'em and flog 'em brigade. But if you feel that instinctively the answer to this question is yes, let's take a tiny moment, if we can, to work out why. Most sentences under 6 months may be scrapped, is their headline. Is there any point sending people to prison for under 6 months, is the question. Your immediate answer is, yes, there is. Yes, there is a point. What is the point? The point is that crime must be punished. And the punishment alternative, the community sentence, doesn't punish them enough. So how do you wriggle out of the observation then that the reoffending rate, which is probably objectively a higher priority, no, than the sense of satisfaction at the severity of the punishment that a criminal receives, the likelihood of them committing another crime surely is a bigger priority. Turning down that likelihood is a bigger priority than satisfying whatever impulse it is that you and I have when we're told about a criminal who hasn't gone to jail. I don't know. I do know something that I'm tempted not to tell you because it took me by surprise. when I last asked you this question, I think the majority of answers came from people, and I tried to confine the contributors to people who had served sentences of under 6 months. Most people who'd been in that situation felt that it was worth doing because they'd had such a shock to the system. They'd had such a wobble of the head, such a mother of all wake-up calls that it impacted upon them very profoundly. But I don't know how representative that was. And I may have asked the question slightly wrong. So if you're given a straight choice between a punishment that makes reoffending less likely and a punishment that makes reoffending more likely, why would you choose the punishment that makes reoffending more likely? 0345 6060 973. Is there any point sending people to prison for under 6 months? Hit the numbers now and you will get through. And if you have been to prison for under 6 months, you will be particularly, but not exclusively, welcome. But I want to add another dimension to the conversation today that I think we didn't do properly last time. And that dimension is this: a community sentence. Particularly, as David Gork says, in the context of new technologies that are coming into play. The use of electronic tagging, the use of drug and alcohol monitoring. It's something else that you cannot fix without spending money. It's yet more evidence that all the ghouls and vampires talking about small states and small government have absolutely no clue what that means in reality. If you want to minimize reoffending, if you want to maximize rehabilitation, you have to spend money in the short term to save fortunes in the long term. Something about this government, or one of the things that gives me hope, is this stress upon prevention in crime and in health. The two big stories of the first 2 days of this week, putting money into prevention. The problem with prevention is it doesn't make headlines. Except that shouldn't be a problem, should it? If it works, you save a fortune in the long run by spending money in the short run, whether it is on obesity treatment that stops people getting conditions that are linked to their obesity later and therefore shortens the waiting list that are full of people with conditions that are linked to their... You know what I mean, but prevention, you're not really going to get a massive front page unless you've got idiots pretending not to understand why making it almost impossible to smoke in public will save a fortune in the long run, or making it almost impossible to smoke in public is good for absolutely everybody, especially the person who thinks that they actually want to smoke in public. But prevention, unless it's being turned into a negative, is not a sexy enough positive to earn front pages. But it should be. Because if I give you a choice between punishing that criminal in a way that makes him or her less likely to offend again, or punishing them in a way that is proven to make them more likely to offend again, on what possible planet would you choose to punish them in the way that makes them more likely to offend again? So tell me about community sentences. Tell me about yours, actually. I am conscious sometimes of overthinking things. 10:17 is the time. Just tell me about yours. What did you do? And of course, that opens the door wide to the possibility that you thought it was ineffective and the statistics be damned. You thought it was a complete waste of time. Or actually, it's one of the most misunderstood, sometimes willfully, elements of the criminal justice system. And if we are to deal with the, quotes, prison's crisis, end quotes, by looking at more imaginative and thoughtful ways of, quotes, punishing, end quotes, people, we need to know a hell of a lot more, don't we, between us, about so-called community sentences. That'll do, I think. That'll get you going, will it? I think so. I hope so. 0345 so, 6060 so, 973 so, oh so, 1017 so. 20 minutes after 10. It's a relatively small cross to bear, but one of the minor setbacks of having an inbox that now pings like a nuclear reactor most mornings, not every morning, but it's almost impossible for me to keep track of the messages that are coming into the program. So unless I catch it in the nanosecond where it's on my screen before it scrolls down, I'll miss it. And I do sometimes worry about the ones that I've missed, especially when they're like this. Morning, James. Right, Steve. What are you going to be talking about today, dude? I'm going to put you on in a while. I've got the World Service on at the moment. Steve, on what possible... And he can't even hear me. Now, on what possible planet am I going to be able to engage with that? What do you want? A bespoke text while you're listening to the World Service about the things that we're doing? I mean, it's nice that I'm in your thoughts. It's nice that you intending to tune in, but I love the idea of sending a text to tell me that you're going to tune in soon. And would I mind letting you know what we're going to be talking? As I say, it's the text I miss that I worry about sometimes. And there it is. There is the question that, if you know Steve, you could pass on to him. Is there any point sending people to prison for under 6 months? I know it's fewer. If you can quantify, if you can count, it's fewer. So it's fewer than 6 months. I don't know if it's wrong to say less, but it's definitely right to say fewer. Harry's in Maidenhead. Harry, what would you like to say?
Well, hi there.
Hello.
I'd just like to say that I've been to prison for 6 months. I served, and I guess it was I was asked a question. Was a disruption to my life. And yes. I will say it was a huge disruption. And I think the question that you were talking about is whether it's a deterrent to reoffend, whether it
works, whether it serves a purpose for society that is rehabilitative and reducing reoffending, or whether it feeds a baser impulse, or somewhere in between the two.
I want to say whether it works or not. That depends actually very much on the individual.
Yes, of course.
Because the person can go to prison and they can take a lot out of it and learn a lot of it. And like I did, I can say, despite being in such a horrific nightmare of a situation, I was able to take some positive things out of it, even being there for just 6 months. But I would never want anyone actually to go through that experience. And I would definitely actually say I don't want anyone to go to prison and whether for 6 months or less, especially not. For sort of minor offences.
What did you do?
Things like this. As for my offence, it was a mixture of things, but essentially the main offence that got me incarcerated was violence against my ex, and also a fire that was caused. Good so Lord. It was a mixture of things. Yes.
Okay.
It was quite the horrific situation.
Well, was that in England? Because I'd have thought violence would have got you a longer sentence than 6 months.
Well, it wasn't actually in England, but it was essentially
okay.
Accused violence, but
all right.
Yeah.
What did it change about you in 2 ways? What did it change about you, and how did it change your behaviour when you got out?
I think it changed. What did it change?
I mean, you can say nothing. It might be nothing.
No, well, people are changing all the time. That's the thing, and we're constantly changing. So it's just it's the thing is that what it changes is actually my perspective and my vision. Actually, I have a much clearer vision of what's going on, because before going to prison, you have no idea. I had no idea of this sort of world. But actually going through that now, there's actually so many people that are being in prison, having their liberty taken away and put into this system. And it's a whole habitat, a community,
But what I need to know is whether or not you would be less likely to commit the sort of crimes you committed, having been to prison for 6 months. I suspect you probably would be less likely, and yet the broader picture.
Yes.
The broader picture is that criminals in general are more likely to reoffend. I suspect you're the opposite of that, aren't you?
Yeah, I would say that I'm less likely to reoffend, exactly because I'm sort of more aware and much more careful now, because definitely do not want to go to prison again. What a nightmare that was. In the broader sense, I would say it definitely doesn't invite any sort of appreciation for this sort of system or service, of prison or of policing or the law or anything like that. What it rather invites is a sense of just, injustice and just because there's a lot of things about the system which, there is no justice really. And so,
what is it designed to do? It's designed to make people who fear being victims of crime feel better. I've got no beef with that. I've got no problem with that. I fear being a victim of crime. But if it is making reoffending more likely, it's actually satisfying that appetite in the short term, but feeding it in the long term. Because if reoffending becomes more likely as a consequence of incarceration, then the fear of becoming a victim of crime increases, or should increase, as opposed to decrease. Thank you, Harry. I respect you not wanting to go into too much detail, but it makes it a little bit difficult, of course, to analyse, and the fact that it wasn't in the UK, doubly so, but very helpful starting point. Robin's in High Wycombe. Robin, what would you like to say? That's a good name. That's a good name for a burglar.
It was my father's middle name, so I kind of got taken on with that one, I'm afraid. Yeah.
What made you pick up the phone, Robin?
But that's not what I was in for. So
I'm glad to hear it.
Brilliant. Yeah, good to finally get on your show. I've tried loads, but basically, I've done community sentences and also done prison half a dozen times. 2 of them short sentences, less than a year. Well, it depends how you look at gosh, really. But the other 4 were for longer because it was repeat offending. But I'm not rehabilitated. I've just got too old to go in a violent place now. It's too violent in there. My last one was just too violent.
So it's a cost benefit analysis for you then.
Absolutely,
and
also on the third one, they nearly really rehabilitated me. They nearly did it. I learned to be a teacher. I was teaching lads to do their level 1s and level 2s, English and maths, and basically when I got out, I couldn't be a teacher because I was in
your record.
Well, yeah, because I grow weed. Well, I was growing weed. I don't do it anymore because I don't want to go to jail.
Well, again, not just growing it, but also selling it, presumably.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But not street dealing.
Were all of your offences?
I'm a social supplier. I was not a dealer. There's a difference.
I hear you. I mean, personally, I don't think I'd send anyone to jail for that kind of offence in the first place, but that's a conversation for a different day.
Well, it's a money crime, isn't it? They always put you away for money crimes.
Yes, that's true. I mean, I don't know if anyone's ever called it white collar. It's more green finger crime. But
exactly.
I'm knocking them out of the park today, Robin. Honestly, I can't keep this up. But were all of your offences in that space?
No, the first 2, which were shorter ones, one was for fox hunt stabbing, and the other one was for poll taxing. But I refused to pay poll tax. Okay. And I went to prison on the. I've also done community service a couple of times as well.
What did you do?
What for the community service ones?
What did you actually do?
Well, that was my first warning on the first warning on the stabbing. That was I had to do the RSPCA. I had to clean out cat poo and dog poo from the. That was a nightmare. That was the worst of it.
But you're not again. I hate it when this happens. That's 2 really interesting calls to kick things off, but not necessarily indicative of the bigger picture. You're a bit of a one-off, really, aren't you? I mean, the punishment that you get for being a hunt saboteur is not going to deter you from becoming a cannabis entrepreneur.
No, because No, not at all. No, not at all.
But also, the experience of prison was not enough as a younger man to put you off doing things that might have sent you to prison. So now, if I gave you the choice between doing a month in prison and a month cleaning out kennels, what would you choose?
Because of the uproar of my life and everything else that a month in jail would cause, I would do the cat poo.
Do the cat back on the cat poo. Back on the cat.
Yeah, honestly, yeah, because when you go to jail for a short sense of time, right? You come out, okay, right? Your whole life is like torn apart. You lose your home, you lose everything.
Yes.
You come out, they give you back in the day it was 47, 57 quid, and then you go off and see your probation officer by 5 o'clock that day. So you got no time to organise somewhere with a stay or anything else, and they put their conditions on you, blah 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 blah.
Yes.
So you go from there, and then you go and find I've got nowhere to go. What do I do? Where do I go?
Yeah.
If you've got no family or things like that, you've got nowhere to go. You've got 57 quid in your pocket. Where do you go? You go and find your man. You go because you're sensible.
You go straight
keep your
back
numbers.
Into it. But this is an argument against imprisonment.
Sort me out a couple of ounces and let's go and jam and I'll go and send money and I can get myself in a hotel that night. Job done.
This is an argument against imprisonment.
Well, yeah, exactly.
If you were cleaning out the cat poo for a month, you wouldn't be in the situation you've just described.
No, because I'd still have my home and I'd still have and also I'm doing an English literature degree now, so that I can actually earn my living some other way, I can't obviously be a teacher. Well, I am, because I can't go back to jail and I can't go back to growing weed because
What books are you doing? What are you studying?
What are you studying? I've just done Moby Dick, and I tell you what, it's hell. I've read it 3 times, you have to keep a dictionary, and you also have to keep a Bible next to you because of the language. And
it's dark, isn't it? It's a lot darker than people realise. A lot of these sort of classics that you get, you read a children's version of it when you're younger, and you don't realise how almost gothic, isn't it, Moby Dick?
Absolutely. absolutely, and written in that way, and then there's written lots of Bible form and everything else. Because back then, that was a lot of language spoken. That was the book everyone read, so that's why they wrote it. So
hang in there, mate.
Yeah, but very good. I've got to. I'm not going back there because I can't.
And so there it is. I mean,
in there now.
Yeah,
just about the quick turnarounds.
Go on.
That's the reason why the quick turnarounds are. I mean, I would give you at least 10-20% that go in on the quick turnarounds. The usual sort of shoplifters, alcoholics, things like that, low-level crimes. So ultimately, you do exactly the same thing to them. So how about the community doing it? That you could save so much money. It's a waste of time. Or why not make them serve their sentences learning the maths and English? Because I'll tell you what, at least 70% of them in jail didn't have their maths and English.
Literacy.
That's why I love doing it.
No, I hear you.
I mean, they punish me.
You could go in and get you a job. We get you a job teaching people who are serving time now. That might work, but some of these ideas will be too imaginative. It's not unlike the website which invited people to contribute their suggestions for improving the NHS yesterday, which somewhat predictably received what I believe is known in the trade as the Boaty McBoatface treatment. I may share some of those nuggets with you shortly. Thank you, Robin. It's 10:31. Thomas Watts has your headlines. 10:35 is the time. Would you like to play a missing word round? I think we could do, couldn't we? Braverman sent government documents to her private email blank times. How many times do you think Suella Braverman forwarded government documents to her private email accounts in a potential breach of the ministerial code? Just another illustration of the double standards with which much of the media treats politicians in this country. So there is somebody in potential breach of the ministerial code, an accusation that applies to precisely none of the people that have been on your front pages recently with regard to Taylor Swift concerts or new spectacles. I do, however, have a question for you about the media. I don't normally do this, and I don't know that if it wasn't the BBC, I don't know that I would do it. But why, given that 10,000 prisoners were released early under the last Tory government, and that the status of prisons as being full is something Rishi Sunak was warned about during the last general election campaign, I'm going to focus this on the BBC. Why are there cameras outside prison gates filming prisoners being released early this week? 0345 6060 973. So 10,000 released under the Tories. The necessity of early release is a direct consequence of prisons policy. I was reminded while talking to Robin a moment ago of Chris Grayling's wizard wheeze to ban prisoners from receiving books in jail. Do you remember that? Got overruled by a High Court judge. Chris Grayling, who I think is, I don't even need to check. I bet you a tenner he's in the House of Lords. Chris Grayling presided over disaster after catastrophe after debacle, up to and including the time he decided it'd be a brilliant idea. You just heard Robin talking about the necessity of learning to read, expanding your horizons, educating yourself, training yourself, all the things that are necessary to the process of rehabilitation. You heard how he talked about Moby Dick. If he hadn't done English in prison, would he have wanted to do that course now? Up to degree level? I think we both know the answer to that. Unlikely, right? So Chris Grayling's idea was not to let them receive books from outside. And I mean, truly incredible. But why are the cameras outside the prisons? Why are BBC cameras outside prisons as Labour embark upon their version of an early release scheme that the Tories both invented and necessitated? Because I could be wrong. I could be wrong. And it's a while since I worked at the Beeb. But I don't remember this happening under the last lot. Who caused it? And did it? So why are there BBC cameras outside prison gates today when the same thing happened under the Tories and the set of circumstances that necessitates an early release scheme is a consequence of 14 years of Tory policy? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. That's a question I want you to answer, because I can't answer it. And normally, historically, I can't answer a question like that. I promise you, you'll think that I'm blowing smoke up your bum. I promise you, I think I'm getting something wrong. I think I'm missing something. But, you know, I sometimes catch a few clips of what happens on Sunday mornings now on the BBC and what was happening a year ago, and I do find myself thinking, maybe there is something a bit grim and sinister going on here. Maybe Robbie Gibb who remains a non-executive director of the BBC, having been director of communications for Theresa May, and somehow deigns to lecture BBC journalists on impartiality, despite having received a peerage for services to the Tory party. I'm not making this up. Maybe his influence is extending a little further than the rest of us realise. But why on earth would there be BBC cameras outside prisons for early release under a government trying to fix the mess caused by the last one? And the last one, to the best of my memory, didn't have cameras out. How many people listening to this didn't even know that the Tories, A, released 10,000, and B, that Rishi Sunak was told by that fella, what's his name? He's gone back to being a lawyer, quite like the cut of his jib. Tory, prisons minister. Come on, what was his name? It'll come to me in a minute. He was told by his own prisons minister that they would have to do something like this in order to avoid precisely the catastrophe that Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper inherited. Alex Chalk, there it is. Not to be confused with Alex Cheese. 10:40 is the time. Liz is in Chelmsford. Liz, what made you pick up the phone?
Hello. Sorry, I'm really nervous. I've not rung before.
It's only me.
So I used to be a prison officer. I was only there for a year or so, but I think I was there just to see enough of
Yes.
what's going on. And just going back to what you were saying about like prison time less than 6 months. In my opinion, I think it is completely pointless. Like if you're going to be in there for that less of a time, I think obviously. Like, I'm not like deminimalising any sort of like crime and stuff, but sort of it may be like a lesser crime, like a petty crime, if you want to use that term, as opposed to like a more serious crime. And the types of people, from what I witnessed in there, could be sort of like I worked in like a young offenders,
right.
And there'd be like sort of like young lads in there, sort of just turned 18, and they'd be in there for, so maybe a bit of possession of cannabis or like other various sort of like quite low like sort of like crimes,
yes.
And then they'd go in there, they'd mix with sort of like more hardened criminals. And in that space of time, they just learn, like, prison ways and just how to become sort of... They didn't get anything from it. There wasn't sort of like a rehabilitation. They were getting worse, if anything.
Well, that fits with the figures. I mean, literally, it literally tells us today, David Gork tells us that the reoffending rate for those who've been in prison for a short amount of time is much higher than for those who served the community sentence.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that obviously, like... these things need doing in the community, and like one of the prison motto is like to help them lead law-abiding and a useful life.
I don't know what's happened
like
to your phone
prison.
line. Your phone line's gone completely south. We'll try and fix it because I just want to. There's a couple more things I want to ask you before we bid each other farewell. I'll try and come back to you in a moment, but I couldn't understand most of what you said in the latter parts of that call. Let's go up to Crosby in Liverpool. Peter's there. Peter, what would you like to say?
James, good morning.
Hello. Chalk and cheese there. Did you hear that call? The quality of Liz's line, and then moving on to it sounds like you're in the next room, and it sounded like she was on the moon. But anyway, these are not the main points to observe, are they? What made you pick up the phone?
Well, my only qualification for phoning up is that I was a probation officer for 35 years.
Right.
So I've got all sorts of answers to this, but none are complete answers because the whole question is so multifaceted
of course.
And nuanced. Now, we talk about the BBC cameras outside the prisons today. It's an easy hit for the BBC, isn't it? Let's implant in the public's consciousness the fact that all these prisoners are coming out from prison early, and some of them could be dangerous, or perhaps many of them are dangerous. Whose fault is that? The Labour government.
Yeah, but why didn't they do it under the last government?
Sorry?
Why didn't they do it under the last government?
Well,
if indeed they didn't, I can't remember it.
James,
well,
it's all a question of bias.
Well, I don't like that. I wouldn't normally buy that. I certainly don't think the people behind the cameras or the reporters doing it are biased. Is it?
No,
it might just be that the newspapers have become the tail that wags the dog, and they don't realise.
Well, yes.
So, do you see what I mean?
Yeah, but could I say something else that further complicates it?
Of course.
When I first entered the probation service in the late 1980s, the prison population was 40,000. It's now over 80,000.
Gosh.
So during that period, there's been a long Labour government, the Blair government. Okay? They introduced the Sentencing Act in the early 2000s, which introduced extended sentences, and people were being over-sentenced willy-nilly. And I remember this from my time as a probation officer. Thousands of those people are still in prison and are hardly ever going to get out in the next 5-6 years because the system is so rigid, clogged up, and unappealing.
I take your point, and and I think we're doing something on elements of that in the not too distant future. But with but the conversation today is specifically about sentences of 6 months or under.
Okay, well, they don't work. They only work with first-time offenders who are so shocked by the impact of that on them, and it's usually people with the less serious offences, let's say driving offences, excess alcohol, that sort of thing.
But would they be unshocked by the community sentence? Do you I mean, because I know this is a counterfactual or a hypothetical, but But doing the shock of being in the system is obviously being sent to jail is going to be an even bigger shock. But do we think that the people you're describing would be likely to reoffend if they had a community sentence? I'm not sure they would.
Not at all, because if people are in work, they can do the community sentence at the weekend. If they're not, they can do it 3 days a week. Community service, and I used to manage it, is essentially a deprivation of liberty.
Yes,
so it is.
Yes, it is. This is the bit that's missing from the conversation, is a proper appreciation of what is the word punishment? I don't know if it's but that is what's missing. Is everybody thinks it's a nonsense or a nothing, but it isn't.
Community service used to be seen as an alternative to custody.
Yes.
And all of a sudden that idea disappeared, and that the whole approach to community sentences follows the waves of differing public opinion about it.
And that's the problem with everything that we talk about, isn't it? Yeah, I know. But which public? I know because they're creating public opinion now. Got a camera outside a prison, and somehow it's Labour's fault that they have to release people from prisons that are full as a direct consequence of Tory policies. I'm always a little reluctant, and Peter touched on the reasons why, to start reaching for the B word in that kind of context, because I don't like it. I don't like what it tells us about what the country has become. And a few of you are pointing out I've written a whole bloody book about it, so I can't really sit here clutching my pearls. And those allegations, accusations, explanations of institutional bias extend all the way to the top of the BBC. But sometimes the evidence still stops you in your tracks, even if you're aware of the broader offence. And having cameras outside prisons for the so-called prisons crisis, when 10,000 were released early under the Tories and Rishi Sunak knew exactly what he was passing on to Keir Starmer, seems to me to be a dereliction of duty, a betrayal of the British public, because you cannot make informed choices and informed decisions without accurate information. 10:46 is the time. And speaking of accurate information, there is some breaking news, and it would have involved reporting orders concerning Chris Kaba, who has obviously been in the news a lot today after the police officer on trial for shooting him was acquitted after just 2 or 3 hours of jury deliberations yesterday. There is some profoundly pertinent breaking news that I will share with you after this. It is 10:49. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I can tell you that reporting restrictions have been lifted following the trial of the police officer accused of murdering Chris Kaba. And those details include the fact that Chris Kaba was a, quote, core member, end quotes, of one of London's most dangerous gangs and had been accused of involvement in 2 shootings in less than a week before he was killed by a police marksman. That couldn't be reported during the trial, but can be reported now. And we'll find out more about those details and perhaps what they mean from LBC's Fraser Knight shortly, who is currently in court. 10 minutes to 11 is the time. And here's the question. Why have cameras and journalists turned up outside prisons for the release of prisoners under a Labour government when nobody turned up for the release of 10,000 under a Tory government? I don't know why. And I mean, it doesn't matter what newspapers and commercial media does, but why is the BBC there? Why is the BBC there? It's confusing to me. But of course, all of it speaks to the question of whether or not there is any point sending people to prison for under 6 months. It's 10 to 11. I was talking to Liz in Chelmsford. We'd covered some ground before her phone went funny. And the question I wanted to ask you is why you only did it for a year, if that's not prying.
It just got a bit too much, I think.
Yes.
I sort of went there. I think I was a little bit naive. I wanted to sort of go there, sort of make a difference, help people. But I think, unfortunately, just the way that things have become, it's not always possible. Sort of, there's sort of like not necessarily that support. Like a lot of people that do the job, they I think it's really sort of like demoralising, I feel.
Because you couldn't make a difference. You wanted to make a difference, but you couldn't.
Exactly.
Essentially, you're doing crowd control or containment rather than actual rehabilitation or improvement.
Exactly. That is exactly it. Exactly it.
How depressing. And that idea of someone turning up, particularly, I imagine, in young offenders, as someone who's sort of teetering or has arrived at a junction in their life.
Yeah.
And the incarceration actually sends them down the wrong path rather than steers them. Yeah.
Obviously, they learn like all these different things there that they learn to become worse criminals, like the drugs as well inside. Like they turn to drugs they wouldn't necessarily have looked at on the outside or as a way of a coping mechanism. And I think it's just sort of a bit of a downward spiral in a lot of cases.
It's hard not to nod along with that, even without the experiences that you have. Liz, thank you. Something sad about that. Someone, a good person wants to do good things, ends up in the system and realises that they can't. A system that, of course, for a long time was run by Chris Grayling, who wanted to ban prisoners from receiving books from family members or friends. From Chelmsford to Leicester, Rachel is there. Rachel, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, hi, good morning.
Hello, Rachel.
I have actually done community service. I did it. I found it totally humiliating. I found it exhausting.
Yes.
I was working full time, so I had to do it on Sundays and bank holidays, so I never got any time off.
Gosh.
And I had to arrange for somebody to look after my dog. And the whole experience was awful. Absolutely awful.
What do you think the experience was designed to do?
The experience, I think, was designed to do exactly what it did. Make me humiliated. I had to follow orders. Yes. I had no freedom. I had to do what I was told. And I was told in a very nice way, don't get me wrong.
Sure.
They weren't abusive in any way. But it's still, as a independent thinking adult in my early 60s then, I found it quite a difficult experience. I'm not known to be a quiet person, but the person who was in charge of me, if you like, she said how quiet I was, and that was because of the impact it was having on me.
Can I ask what you did? Punish what crime you'd done?
Fraud.
Okay. And presumably your record and your age would have played a part in the sentencing decision as opposed to sending you to prison.
Well, it was a very minor offence.
Okay.
It wasn't a lot of money. In fact, it probably cost them more to take me to court than the amount that was involved.
But the principle, of course, is both deterrent and punishment. And so when
Absolutely,
I say to you...
of course, I accept that completely.
What if you'd gone to jail for 4 months or 5 months?
I think I would have committed suicide.
Oh, my days.
I was in a very, very bad place. I had some terrible... I lost my mum, my dad and my brother, my oldest brother, in the space of 4 years. And I came out of an abusive relationship and ended up in rented accommodation, having left him in my house.
Okay.
So I was in a really, really, really bad place. And
did community service sort of steer you back towards a healthier path then? Would we go that far or not?
Yes, I would say it totally did.
Wow.
It totally did. But of course, it also had an impact on my family,
yes.
My children. And my daughter was incredibly supportive, but my son, I think, still to this day is, I feel, ashamed of me.
But there'd be more shame if you'd gone to jail, wouldn't there?
I would imagine so, yes.
What would that have achieved?
Exactly. And what might have happened to me anyway, if I was in there, I would have gone 2 ways. I may have been angry, bitter, and reoffended,
yes,
or
worse.
Done what I said. And yes,
of course. And
because who would have supported my mental health?
And this is, I mean, you tick 2 boxes, actually, if you forgive my sort of glib language, because both a relatively minor offence that could have been punished in one of 2 ways, and also an increasing sense among this government that we send far too many women to jail as it is, because the punishment is different for a mother than it is for a woman than it is for a man in many, many ways. And that isn't an opinion, that's just counting. Thank you, Rachel. 10:56 is the time. Fraser Knight is outside the Old Bailey, where some reporting restrictions upon the trial of the police officer acquitted yesterday after just 2 or 3 hours of jury deliberations of murdering Chris Kaba have been lifted. Fraser, what's happened?
Well, James, the family of Chris Kaba had applied to extend some of these reporting restrictions about Kaba's history, but the judge today has refused that application. And so for the first time, we can now report that Chris Kaba was a member of a notorious gang in South London called the 6-7 Gang. And in the days before he was shot dead by the armed policeman Martin Blake, he was actually accused of being involved in 2 separate shooting incidents. One in Brixton just the night before he was killed, and one a few days earlier at a nightclub in Hackney. Now, earlier this year, there were a number of other associates from the 6-7 Gang who went on trial for that shooting at the nightclub in Hackney. 3 of them jailed for their involvement in that. Chris Kaba was actually named on the indictment and was described as being a core member of the gang, the gunman who opened fire on the dance floor, but we couldn't report that at the time because of these reporting restrictions. Now, of course, yesterday Martin Blake was cleared of Chris Kaba's murder, and during the trial the court had heard that when he pulled the trigger he wasn't aware of who the driver was. He didn't know that that was Chris Kaba, but what he did know was that in terms of the shooting in Brixton the night before outside a school, the suspects were still at large, the gun hadn't been found, and this car that Chris Kaba was driving, the Audi Q8, had been linked to that shooting, and that was why the police pursuit had happened. We can also report as well, James, some of Chris Kaba's previous convictions. He has been in jail a number of times, and those convictions going all the way back to when he was 13 years old, including offences for stabbing with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, possession of an imitation firearm, and also involvement in the gang as well. There was an interim gang order in place to put restrictions on some of those members of the 6-7 Gang, of which there are dozens of known members as it stands. But that reporting restriction in this trial has been lifted, so we can say that Chris Kaba was accused of being involved in 2 separate shooting incidents in the week before he was killed.
What would the jury? I appreciate Sergeant Martin Blake would have been unaware of who was in the car at the time, although all too aware of the car being associated with that previous shooting. The jury would have been unaware of all of this as well, would they?
They were, yeah. So all of this came out in what's known as legal arguments before the trial began, and the facts that were put before the jury were simply around what had happened and the intelligence of what had happened on that night when the police were pursuing the vehicle. So all they were told was that this car had been linked to a shooting incident the night before, and that Martin Blake didn't know who the driver was, but was chasing that car which had been linked to it. So all of this not included in that trial, hence why we weren't able to report it. But now with those restrictions lifted, despite the efforts of Chris Kaba's family to keep them restricted from publication, we can now report that because of the restrictions being lifted.
Fraser Knight, thank you. Live from the Old Bailey with some important and interesting developments in that Chris Kaba trial, a trial in which the jury took just 3 hours to find the police officer, Sergeant Martin Blake, innocent of all charges, cleared over the killing of 24-year-old Chris Kaba, who was shot in the head while trying to ram his way out of a police roadblock in September of 2022. There was one headline this morning which I thought was really striking, and it spoke to exactly where my thoughts were as well, and it was about how the verdict had left all sides angry. And you would hope that some of the detail that has subsequently emerged might at least have assuaged the anger of one side, but almost certainly not the other. It's 11 o'clock. It is 4 minutes after 11, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And with those reporting restrictions lifted, we can turn our attention now to this case of Chris Kaba and the prosecution of the police officer who killed him. it's not failed prosecution, is it? But what is it? I suppose it is a failed prosecution. The decision was taken that there was enough evidence there to pursue a criminal trial, but he was acquitted after just 3 hours of deliberations. And the front page I was referring to a moment ago, anger on all sides as Met officer cleared of murder. And oddly this morning, I started talking to the producer about this case before I'd seen that front page. And I said, and remember, I knew about the details upon which reporting restrictions have been lifted shortly before you did, but I didn't know when I got into work this morning. That's because I work in a newsroom. And it struck me as a very good headline, because one side is, I don't like sides in the context of this conversation. I am on the side of justice. I'm on the side of transparent justice. And I'm also, when it comes to a criminal and the police, I'm on the side of the police. But there is also institutional racism in the Metropolitan Police Service, and there are cases in the past of people being targeted as a consequence of their ethnicity differently from how they would have been had they had a different ethnicity. I am of the view, for the record, that this is categorically not one of those cases, and the details that have emerged in the last 20 minutes speak very much to that conclusion. But both sides, is there a better word to use than sides? Both sides will still be angry. People are, and I don't want this to turn into a kind of race thing, although my inbox already suggests that it is. That by sides, there are people who think that Chris Kaba was a victim of a miscarriage of justice. And then on the other side, there are people who don't think that Sergeant Martin Blake should ever have been in court at all. To which and remember, I'm doing this absolutely off the back of the news, but I don't know that this could have gone any, I don't want to say better, but oddly more effectively. So although there are people who will still be convinced that something terrible has happened here, I'm afraid that belief is rather violently undermined by both footage of the events and, of course, the details that have subsequently emerged. Not that the police officer concerned would have known that, which is why it needed to go to trial. So I quite like it when this happens. I'm having a thought that, as far as I'm aware, no one else has had yet. And it's a thought that I had before this press conference was given. It's a thought that I had before these reporting restrictions were lifted, but it's not a thought I would have built a phone in on until the restrictions were lifted. And that thought is this: I think it's gone about as well as anybody could have hoped. There's been a trial, so people worried that somebody black might have been shot in circumstances that had more to do with his blackness than his criminality or the threat that was being posed to the police. They have had a jury trial. They have seen Sergeant Martin Blake acquitted after just 3 hours of deliberations by a jury of his peers. And I can live with the suggestions and the objections that the trial never should have happened. I tell you what this is about. And you're indulging me, and so I'm grateful to you, because this is really me thinking out loud. So I've got the bit that I couldn't get my head around before. So you get now senior police officers, both ex and current, queuing up to say he should never have been on trial at all, to which I cautiously respond by saying, of course he should, because I have faith in the criminal justice system. Not untrammeled faith, but how can a senior police officer say he should never have come on trial at all unless he's worried that he might have been convicted? Whereas if you have faith in both the innocence of Sergeant Martin Blake and the probity of the criminal justice system, then you need to have trials, because an acquittal at trial is important. It's not proof that he never should have been prosecuted. It's proof that the criminal justice system has worked. There were enough questions over the circumstances of that killing to merit an investigation. Enough of those questions went unanswered by the investigation to merit a prosecution. And there was enough evidence in court presented to the jury to merit an almost immediate acquittal. So your opinion on this story shouldn't change when you discover that Chris Kaba was in one of London's most dangerous gangs and would have faced trial for trying to kill a rival in a nightclub shooting had he not been killed himself days later by a police marksman. And of course, his fellow gang members were convicted for that crime. So that shouldn't affect your opinion of this. But the simple question of whether or not that police officer acted in good faith, acted in fear of being mown down by a driver of a car that was known to be associated with a shooting the previous evening, what should have happened differently is what I'm asking you in a way. 0345 6060 973. I'm not being contrary. I see a headline that says anger on all sides as Met Officer cleared of murder, and I find myself determined not to be on any side in a story like this because it shouldn't really be about sides. If you're on the side of criminal justice, if you're on the side of justice and you have now learned what has happened here, would it not be the case that you have to tell both supporters of Chris Kaba who were protesting outside the court, in some cases without knowing the full picture, and supporters of Sergeant Martin Blake who have been protesting all along, knowing more perhaps of the full picture, there had to be a trial, right? And because we live in a society, we live in a system where jury trial is relatively sacrosanct, and also acts as an antidote to the perceived institutional racism of the police service. And this is the only way that the story could have unfolded, albeit that it is hellish for the police officer concerned. And I often get calls from men and women who've served with SO19, I think it is, who've been armed police officers, and it's a weird job. It's a job that a lot of coppers don't want to do. Whenever we do, shall we arm the police, I get police officers queuing up to tell me that they don't want to carry a gun. But is the trial not an occupational hazard? The idea that the fear of a trial would prevent you from discharging your firearm when you should, that's a powerful argument. That's a powerful argument. But it's not powerful enough to say that you can't scrutinise these sort of cases whenever they occur. So the headline that says anger on all sides as Met Officer cleared of murder, because some people believe Chris Kaba was killed unfairly. Some people in that camp believe he was killed unfairly because he was black. Some people will still believe that, despite the case having shifted slightly, because the idea that the police officer concerned was in fear of his own life, that the police officers genuinely feared that he was going to try and ram his way out of this stop, seems to me to be pretty close to inarguable. But that then shifts the pendulum to the other side of the debate, to use the words on the front of the Times, anger on all sides as Met Officer cleared of murder. He should never have been on trial at all. Police chief says case shows system is broken. Former coppers queuing up to say, that's the bit I can't get my head around. Maybe you can help me. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. This had to happen in the way that it happened, didn't it? This is exactly what should have happened and exactly what needed to happen. And if people are left unsatisfied, that is not something that could have been addressed by a different course of action. It is literally trial by jury. People who bang on about Magna Carta without really knowing what it means, and similar sort of great tropes of ignorant rhetoric, very, very occasionally accidentally know what they're talking about. This is trial by jury. This is evidence presented in an open court to 12 men and women. And they have concluded within 3 hours that nothing illegal happened here. Quite the opposite. They've concluded that when Sergeant Martin Blake discharged his firearm, he did so because he feared, with good cause, that Chris Kaba was poised to drive his car, to use his car as a weapon, to drive his car at the police officers who were stopping him because the car he was in had been involved in a shooting the previous night, a shooting for which he would have been put on trial if he hadn't been killed. But the second bit doesn't matter. That's why this is not my clearest introduction of all time, because like you, I'm reacting to new information. But that's the point. So everybody's telling me this shouldn't have come to trial. I'm telling you, it absolutely should have done. There's a case perhaps for not naming the police officer, so we'll add that to the mix. I wasn't sure what to do there. You'll have noticed when I was talking to Fraser, I didn't say the name, but then Fraser said the name. I think correctly. He's in the Old Bailey. So I've now said the name of but I don't know. Would the police officer rather that I never mentioned his name again? In which case I would completely respect that wish, because he is a completely innocent man doing a job for which we should all be grateful. If no one's doing jobs like that, then people who well, they're murderers, commit more murders. So it is tempting and easy to say that this trial should never have happened, but the acquittal of the sergeant concerned, to me, makes it clear that it absolutely should have done. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. This is not a case where nobody has been satisfied. This is a case where justice has been seen to be done, both for Chris Kaba, his supporters and his family, and for Sergeant Martin Blake's supporters and his family. I suppose those are your two sides. But justice has been seen to be done, hasn't it? Now, I'm not going to apologise in advance if I've got this horribly wrong. I'm just going to remind you that I'm responding to news that broke at approximately 5 to 11 this morning, but it speaks to something that had been bubbling away in my brain before 10 o'clock today. And that was that this is and it's a horrible story, it's a horrible episode, it's a horrible saga, but it couldn't and shouldn't have unfolded any differently. Should it? And that's your question. It couldn't and shouldn't have unfolded any differently. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. I suppose one other complication, one other wrinkle is that, you know, the CPS is run by human beings, and if they felt more keenly the need to put this police officer on trial because of the established institutional racism in the Metropolitan Police, then that would be bad. I mean, it wouldn't have happened consciously. Nobody would have said so. But and therefore it's not something that we can know one way or the other. But it speaks to a subject that is I both a little bit more complicated than some people allow, and a heck of a lot more straightforward at this point in proceedings, as far as I'm concerned. The senior police will always try to excuse their operatives from scrutiny. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. If I were the head of the Met, which isn't going to happen in a billion years, I would is celebrate the right word? The verdict yesterday would be proof that nobody is above the law. Even a police officer who has shot somebody is not above the law. I'll tell you why I'm saying that. This came in from Lou just during that introduction. As a black American, I would welcome this process for every police-involved killing. It took me 20 minutes to say that, except, of course, I'm not a black American, but the process is the story here, not the people. I think, and I could, of course, be wrong. James is in Bristol to kick things off. James, what do you think?
James, good morning. And it's actually probably linked to the previous text that you've just said. I think the process here has been a positive one. I think where an event of an armed police officer discharging his or her weapon against a gunman with an inherent right to self-defence, it's pretty clear cut. But a process and due diligence must be done.
Yes.
Whereas this event here it's not as such grey, but it's not a firearm being discharged to the police. It's the police making a decision on the spot that a vehicle was being used, and therefore lethal defence was in the need for the inherent right to self-defence.
So because it's a car rather than a gun, it feels different.
I think so.
I think you're probably right, but it shouldn't, and that's the point of the criminal justice system, is that it doesn't make those distinctions, which are, I don't know if they're emotional, but they're certainly not material.
But it comes back to the previous text. So if the process needs to go through, and we need to trust the system, and it's difficult to say that when we know there's, racism within a force, that when you put there's items outside of the context which have just been released at 11 a.m., which which support the argument. Without the context, it's quite easy for both sides of the parties to become quite emotional.
Well, it is, and they will continue to do so. But of course, the jury didn't know this information. The jury was simply charged with deciding whether or not the police officer concerned realistically, and in fact beyond reasonable doubt, feared for his own life as a consequence of what he believed Chris Kaba was going to do with that car. And that's why the verdict came in as not guilty of murder.
No, and I'm sure, and I'm sure you'll have many colleagues ring in and correct me if I'm wrong, but where a police officer discharged their weapon against a live gunman, I would be surprised if a thorough process like this doesn't go ahead. It's just not in the public eye. So we don't routinely see it.
No, and you know, two things can be true at the same time. This police officer did not commit murder, and the Metropolitan Police Service has a long and hideous history of institutional racism. These things can be true at the same time, and you know, one it does not have to have any bearing at all upon the other, and that's where I think we are. But you know, easy for me to say. Thank you, James. David's in Canary Wharf. David, what would you like to say?
Hiya, James. I feel like you just stole a bit of my thunder there.
Oh no! I'm sorry. Well, let me give it back.
No, I mean I've been in a scenario whereby I've been stopped by the police in a rental car that was reported stolen by the company before and it wasn't changed.
Gosh.
I've had 2 police officers at my door with guns.
Over that case?
Yeah, exactly.
Send armed police over a rental car? Okay.
Yeah. But when those sorts of things happen, it is when it comes down to our community, it is terrifying because it doesn't happen a lot in other communities.
Oh,
and I know that it probably wouldn't have been dealt with in that way. With this case, I just feel like we talk about it like a perceived institutional racism when we have the McPherson report, which it clearly makes the linings for it. We have the new Cassie report, which clearly makes the lining for it. Yeah. And we have pages within the Lamy report, which clearly indicate that if someone is in prison and they're innocent, that they're more likely to be black because of it. And that is literally the police putting you in remand. So that's the police situation. It has nothing to do with CPS yet or anyone else. So we have clear indicators for racism within the police force.
Absolutely.
But we have the commissioner come on live air and accept all of the failings of the Met apart from the institutional racism bit. And when someone like Jeremy Corbyn done exactly the same thing with his report, which was stabbing at some of the failings that he had within the Jewish community, he was immediately fired. But we don't treat racism for black people in the same way.
Okay.
So it's about the whole bubble. It's when we look at racism and institutional racism with the police.
No, but we're not looking at that. We're separating that today from what's happened in the case of Chris Kaba. So I think what you're saying is that. And I would almost certainly agree with you that if I had accidentally or unwittingly been driving a stolen rental car around London, I don't think armed police would have turned up at my front door.
No.
And the reason they turned up at your front door is because of your ethnicity. Possibly age would come into it, but nowhere near as much as ethnicity would. But none of that changes what happened in court yesterday. The two things can be true at the same time.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. You know, the court finding, I have no problem with whatsoever. I think that it's brilliant that it was done, and it shows that justice is truly blind at this stage because they didn't release Chris Kaba's information to the jury, and I think that's fantastic. I think that's the way it should have been done.
Well, if they had, I mean, it would have been 3 minutes of deliberations by the jury as opposed to 3 hours. So that's another reason to... I haven't got the right vocabulary today, David, because words like celebrate seem horribly inappropriate in these kind of contexts. But this is cause to remember the importance of the trial by jury system and our criminal justice system, the least bad available option in all circumstances.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of... There must have been information that led the police to that place, and the only probably takeaway that I would have from this process is that at the end of the day, we don't know whether a police officer is racist or is not or whatnot. All we have are the facts, and the facts that drew them to Chris Kaba at that point is there's an assumed criminality and he was suspected of doing something. Now, the actual event that happened, did that justify him being shot in the head? That's what was on trial, and that's what we're looking at.
And that's what took the jury 3 hours to answer.
And I think that was fair. That's completely fair. And if every single one of our incidences that happened like this happen and have this process, I think we'd be better off.
Well, then, and in fact, we're almost at half time in this conversation because the pendulum swings now to the question of whether or not the police officer concerned. And I've got the luxury of pontificating on whether or not I should repeat his name, because should his name have even been in the public arena, and should he have been put on trial? I think David and I would both say yes. The trauma notwithstanding, the unpleasantness of this process notwithstanding, the whole point of justice is that it must be seen to be done. The transparency of the process is another reason to remember the importance of cherishing the criminal justice system that we had. And I'll read you two quick texts because I think they sit rather powerfully in relief to each other. Scott writes, what will the headline be for the armed policeman that's killed or critically injured by a criminal having taken a moment too long deciding if he wanted the suspension and life-changing trial before discharging his weapon? It wouldn't make page 10 on most papers. I agree with the trial, but the fact that the officer has received threats to his life and his family, he has been destroyed no matter the outcome. It's a point. It's a valid point. I mean, if you are going to have those moments, whatever word you prefer, then you shouldn't be doing that job. Is a very easy thing to say, but something that a lot of people in the job would explain better than I can. But that was Scott. Anthony makes a rather different point. As a paramedic, the possibility of being called to coroner's court and, of course, sometimes criminal court is part of the job, James. But it is an essential part to hold clinicians to account for their actions. Surely a trial such as the one regarding Mr. Kaba's death is just as essential for holding the police to account for incidents such as this. If an internal or even an independent review was carried out, there would always be arguments that it was biased. This is really powerfully put, actually, and the paramedic parallel is one I wouldn't have seen without your help, Anthony in Sheffield, who concludes, I agree wholeheartedly that trials such as this are required to root out the facts and clear the air following these events. It's a certain type of journalist who fetishizes the police, gets very excited when people turn up in uniform for interviews. And of course, if you work for the Murdoch media, then the absolute up to and including criminal associations between members of my profession and members particularly of the Metropolitan Police Service are extremely well documented. Journalists have gone to jail. But that's not the point. The point is the one that Anthony makes from the position of being a paramedic. Senior police officers may say this person should never have been put on trial, but senior police officers have got a job to do. And that job is not always in the best interest of the British public. Sometimes it's in the best interest of the British police. 11:30 is the time. Thomas Watts is here now with the headlines. 33 minutes after 11 is the time. Reasonable force, self-defense, whatever other phrase is pertinent. If a killing has occurred, then deciding whether or not it was lawful, writes Corpsey, should not be in the realm of the police. And that seems to me to be really important. It's why a trial, although no doubt horrible and traumatic for the police officer and indeed his family, and of course there's always the fear of being found guilty. Innocent people go to jail routinely in this country, especially if you want to knit two themes of this conversation together, especially if they're black. But two things can be true at the same time. And it was one police officer on trial. It was not the Metropolitan Police Service. It wasn't 50 years of institutional racism. It was one police officer and the actions of that police officer in a single moment. And without a trial, I would not be able to say to you that justice has been seen to be done. Now, the family of Chris Kaba, who were keen to keep his own long and hideous criminal past out of the public discourse for a little longer, they will never feel that way. They will never feel that justice has been seen to be, or some of them will, but some of them won't. But that's true of all criminals everywhere, whether they're killed in the commission of their crimes or not. Some people will never accept that justice has been seen to be done. But the role of a trial by jury is to reassure the public that our justice system is both fit for purpose and transparent. If he had been found guilty of the murder of Chris Kaba and then the criminal past of Chris Kaba had come out, none of this would have changed. It would have been a harder position to argue for me, I think, just in some ways. But you know me, I still would have tried, because that is the point. The jury made its decision based on what was known to them. So, in fact, by asking that question, you prove my point. And I don't think you were trying to undermine me. But by asking what would have happened if all this had come out after a murder verdict, after a guilty verdict had come in, the point would have been proved, because the guilty verdict was delivered by the jury on the evidence available to them. It subsequently emerges that he was facing prosecution for involvement in 2 more murders and had a long and hideous history of criminality and gang membership. That can't be part of the moment. I mean, if the police officer had known about all of that, then the decision to shoot would have been, I suspect, easier to understand and possibly easier to take. But that line there from Corpsey, there is no doubt that the police officer shot him. So start with what you know. There is no doubt that the police officer shot him. As with all self-defense cases, it must then be proven that it was reasonable force. I fail to see what's controversial here. A killing occurred. Deciding if it was lawful or not should not be in the realm of the police. Whatever Mark Rowley might say, or whatever, various old coppers might say, you don't get to mark your own homework. What's the Latin? Quis custodes or something like that? Oh, my parents deserve a refund, don't they, on my school fees? But who guards the guards? Who polices the police? Some of these old coppers coming out saying he should never have been on trial sound to me as if they're suggesting they should police the police, and that when a police officer shoots someone, he should face much less scrutiny, a much lower system of trial and examination than a civilian would if they shot somebody. Forgive me if I'm missing the point here, but I want the police to be held to a higher standard than the criminals. I want the police to be more likely to end up being properly investigated and properly scrutinised. If we live long enough to move back towards a place where we don't know about the existence of people like David Carrick, and we don't know about the existence of institutional, generational racism in the police service, then maybe the position will change. But right now, I don't think there is anything unreasonable about asking the police to prove that they're not criminals. And they have. He has. Categorically, irrefutably, in a court of law, with a jury of his own peers. I don't like the glibness of the question that I'm asking you, but what's not to like? 0345 6060 973. Molly's in Christchurch. Molly, what would you like to say?
Hiya, yeah. I'm a 7 police officer. I've been in police since 2020 and currently serving detective. And I've got to be, I agree with you. I think that the best thing that could have happened has happened in the circumstances. I do also agree with the point, though, about the releasing of his name. I think that's possibly made the whole situation quite difficult for him to continue serving. I think that was probably my only issue.
Do we know why the judge decided to do that?
I'm not sure. I mean, again, all these decisions are sort of taken just from either side, so I'm not really sure why that decision was taken. I think that's probably something that, if were this to happen again, I think his name should have been released if he were to have been found guilty. I think, but prior to that, he's almost. To others, because it's so, it's such an emotional thing, and he's going to be found guilty by people.
Yeah, and he was receiving threats, so his identity was known to the people who were making the threats, of course. The reasoning is part of the bigger picture, actually, because the reasoning is, you've heard me banging on endlessly about transparency and justice must be seen to be done, and why the police shouldn't have any special dispensations. You have to think about the climate we're in as well, and also what we're trying to achieve. The reason I joined the police is at such a time when complete lack of respect really for the police and complete mistrust. I think actually this is the kind of thing that does need to happen, because we've got to sort of start back to basics and say, okay, hold us accountable, be transparent, and if that makes us a bit uncomfortable for a bit of time, well then that's what's necessary, because again, you're all by consent. You can't and these processes need to happen in open court with a jury. I think
because now, like, he is innocent. So people that are kind of undecided or weren't sure how they felt about it, this kind of answers that question for them. This has been, the facts have been laid out.
Justice has been seen to be done.
Yeah, and the information that's come out afterwards is, obviously it supports the argument that the decision was correct. The officer didn't have that information at the time.
Nor did the jury.
However, in that split second and having the footage been released, I think more, because this is the problem I think with policing, is we don't give enough information to the public. We don't release enough body-worn video. We don't release, so often, you get sort of half facts and people go, well, why have they done that? Why didn't they just do this? And actually, we've now
Quite
had
a lot of
the
coppers
opportunity
say
to
that.
say.
I've heard a lot of coppers say that. What do you think the reasoning is from upstairs that isn't done more routinely?
I think just the same with any sort of public sector, like leadership in public sector at the moment is, I think they're just
suboptimal.
They're so scared. There's a fear of doing anything that's different because we don't do that, and that's kind of the attitude. So I think that's across all public services.
And the technology overtakes the best practice, doesn't it? Sometimes, and the managements on they didn't do the technology in their training. It's not part of what they're best. No, exactly.
They're not the best at public relations. So the people sometimes making these decisions are not people that they're not spin doctors. They're they're Gary that's worked his way up the ranks. So it's like
Have you got someone in mind, Molly, when you say that?
No, I've seen it when people have made the wrong decision and they've put someone on Facebook and it's like, oh Jesus, like, oh my God, why?
Well, we forget that people are human sometimes, and we have great expectations.
They're not political spin doctors. They're not politicians. So, but I just think,
The only nit I'd pick with you is, and I've read what the judge said about the decision to reveal the officer's identity. He decided that there was not a real and immediate risk to him or his family if his identity was made public. So I think it's important to know that the judge will have seen all of. I know you know this, but some other people listening need to hear it. But I think if I had to defend the decision to name him, I would appeal to what I was saying just before you came on about the necessity of police officers being held to at least the same standard as a civilian, and if not a higher standard. So the idea that you would enjoy anonymity would slightly hamper the notion of transparency and justice.
But then people found innocent at trial aren't then going back to the public eye. They're not the one. They're not then back on the streets. They're not then back holding a gun. They're not. It is. But no, I understand. I think we're on the back foot.
You are on the back foot, and of course none of this is helped by some figures in public life who are jumping on opportunities to criticise or castigate the police whenever the opportunity arises, up to and including, of course, inciting those race riots which blighted the country not too long ago. And the comments from the judge in this case are pretty clear, actually, on the decision to name the officer concerned, having considered all of the intelligence available and concluded that the threats to him and his family were not credible. Of course, if it's your family that's under threat, it sounds like splitting hairs, but that's what judges have to do. Thank you, Molly. That was brilliant. A couple of people suggesting that you have covered absolutely everything, and that was the chapter and verse on what can and can't be said about this issue, particularly pertinent coming from a serving police officer. Mendoza is in Vauxhall. Mendoza, what would you like to say?
Yes, James. The thing that confuses me is the fact that this guy was boxed in and there was nowhere for him to go. And I can't understand what the urgency was to do what they did. They could have just folded their arms and just stood there and watched him because,
but he was driving at them.
Oh, of course he was, but
if I'm driving at you, you don't just fold your arms and stand there, do you? I don't really do phone-ins about people who weren't in court doing the.
He was not in a tank.
I'm pretty sure people are killed by vehicles that are not tanks every day in this country.
Yeah, but they didn't. He was going nowhere. This is like shooting flipping.
The car was moving.
A barrel. So what?
Well,
so what?
Then he was trying to go somewhere.
He could not go anywhere. He was boxed in.
Then why didn't he get out of the car with his hands up then?
Well, the thing is, this is where common sense starts to come into play here. Is that they needed
better late
to
than
do,
never. Better late than never, Mendoza.
It's just to what they didn't.
What would you do?
They didn't need to do anything. They didn't need to do what they did.
The car was suspected of not even suspected, believed to be involved in a murder, or a shooting the previous evening.
Yeah.
Therefore, the suspicion that the person in it would also have perhaps been involved in a shooting the previous evening is both pertinent and relevant. Therefore, the idea that you leave somebody you suspect of involvement in a shooting the previous evening, what do you leave him and wait for what to happen, mate?
He, like I say, he was boxed in. He couldn't even. I tell you what, I don't think he could even have opened the doors. You know what I mean?
But you're not. You're denying the evidence of your own eyes here. He didn't park the car, put it into neutral, and get out, did he? He was trying to escape.
Yes, he was. But like I said,
so what should they have done differently?
They could have used their common sense.
No, but that's not. You can't say that. What are you going to do? I'm going to use my common sense. Tell me what they could have done.
They had him. They had their man.
He's trying to escape in a car by driving over them.
Try. The operative word is try.
No, you're not making any sense, mate. Sorry.
Of course I am. He couldn't go anywhere.
He could drive over them. That's what he was trying to do.
Drive over what? They boxed him back and front.
Right, I don't know.
Inside,
I can give you, mate. I only got an E in physics at GCSE, and it was in 1988. So I'm not sure I'm qualified to explain this to you. But if I am in a car,
yes,
and you are standing in front of me, I am not boxed in.
James, I don't think you've watched the footage, have you?
It's 2 tons, that car.
Have you watched the footage, James? Well, can't you see that he was trying to trying to go backwards and forwards to move his vehicle?
Yes.
And
what was stopping him from doing so?
The police vehicles which had boxed him in.
And you don't think that you could? Oh, okay. I mean, I'll leave it there. I mean, I think the Audi is the biggest SUV currently on the market. But if you think that can be contained in the kind of circumstances that you're describing, then that's fine. But you're just wrong. Sorry. It's just a silly argument. That is one of the reasons why I generally don't do phone-ins about evidence that is being analysed after the event by people who weren't in court. It's 11:47. It is 10 to 12 then, and indeed you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. 2 texts come. I don't know what the last fellow was talking about either. I appreciate that the feelings can run very high, but you cannot watch that footage and think they should have just let him go, let him drive away, especially knowing that the car had been involved in a shooting the previous night. And not knowing, of course, that so had he, or at least that he was facing trial for involvement in the shooting. This caught my eye from Leanne. James, my partner is a TPAC, which is Tactical Pursuit and Containment, I think, and advanced trained police officer who is involved daily in pursuits, the kind of thing you see on the telly on traffic cops. What Chris Kaba was trying to do to those officers keeps me up at night. The amount of damage that can be done by one of those cars when ramming officers or vehicles is scary. That being said, I totally agree with the process that has been followed, apart from maybe naming the officer. John sees things differently. He says, no, James, I think you'll find your last caller was completely correct and that you are racist and wrong because people like you just pretend that blacks matter to earn the pound. To which, I mean, the question has to be, what do you think they should have done differently? And all that Mendoza said was use common sense, to which I would urge you to go back and have a look at the footage that the jury saw and tell me the point at which common sense would have come into play and exactly what it would have looked like. But we're not doing that because we're not in court. We're looking instead at the wisdom or otherwise of this trial. And interesting that I haven't, and I'm sure I have, received them, but I haven't seen the messages from police officers telling me that it should never have gone to trial. I know I sometimes cling to penny drop moments a little too tightly, but the idea that justice has been seen to be done, whether everybody likes it or not, seems to me to be really powerful and important. Justice has been seen to be done. And if the police had been left to investigate this themselves, it would not have been. Full stop, dare I say. Will's in Tunbridge Wells. Will, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. How are you?
Very well.
James, I think, if I'm honest, you're sort of half right.
Go on
right,
then.
Right?
Yes.
So in terms of, you are correct that the justice has very openly seemed to be done, and in a very transparent process, which of course is inherently helpful, and helps hopefully both sides see that the outright outcome has been achieved. However, there is a consequence to putting a person through something like that. And I think a little bit we've forgotten about the officer in question and what they have been put through. So, I think it can be agreed now that what they did was the correct thing to have done in all the circumstances, although the outcome was horrendous and no one would have liked it.
Some people will disagree, as Mendoza demonstrated a moment ago. But,
absolutely, yeah.
But I take your point.
Yeah, we feel differently, but I think it's best we can say that it was as it was, and I think the fact that it got to the point of going to trial, I think where contention lies is that why wasn't that decision made earlier? Could it have been made earlier? Was it the right decision by the CPS, for example, to have passed it up in the first place, or are we looking at a situation by which the CPS, because of the volatile nature of the situation, didn't want to make that decision themselves, and so rather than make that decision, they put it up to a jury to do it for them? And is it the place of juries? Is it fair?
You're not telling me anything. You're asking me questions. So tell me what you think.
Okay, I think what I'm saying is that no, I don't think it is the right place. I think we do need transparency. I don't think it is right for the police to mark their own homework, especially in situations.
So it needed to go to trial.
But I think we don't use jury trials and we don't criminalise police officers to achieve that goal. I think that is a misuse of the system. I think it's unfair on police officers, especially in situations like this, which are inherently dangerous. And quickly to your point around the naming, I mean that I don't understand what led to that decision. I don't think it was the right decision. That put that officer's life at risk and his family's life at risk. And I don't think.
Well, that's not the case, as the judge has explained in court. That the threats to the officer and his family were not considered to be credible. That was explained, I think, and then there were 3 months during which the naming of the officer, the delay of 3 months, would allow for, and I quote, the imposition of any additional mitigating measures to be put in place. So you can't use that as a grounds for the point that you're making. So in the event of it not going to trial, how would we have known what happened?
Well, I think that
who would you have asked me to trust?
Well,
if not the jury.
No, I think what this probably raises is a question as to whether there is a need for something new to be created off the back of all this. Whether and I think that is the question here. I don't think that a jury trial is necessarily the right way of doing it. I think that maybe we need something new, so that we can have something transparent.
Okay, well, again, I don't want to badger you, but we're talking about the options that were available to the criminal justice system, and you started by suggesting the CPS shouldn't have done what they did. You can't answer that by saying we should invent a new thing that they could do in the future but couldn't have done in this case. And second, like what? What's the new thing we should invent? Are you a police officer?
Yes.
I thought so. What's the new thing we should invent?
Well, I think an independent. If the concern is around whether the right thing was done or not, and people are saying, well, if the police investigate their own home, of course we're going to find in our own favour.
Yeah, I know all that. What's the thing we should do instead? What's the system of justice that a police officer should be able to enjoy that I can't?
Well, I don't think it's not apples and apples here we're comparing. So
I could shoot someone in self-defence, not necessarily in the commission of my job, but there are cases of people coming into houses. But park that if you don't like it, and just tell me what the new system is that you're calling for.
Well, I think a new system that maybe involves an exterior scrutiny from a new public body that can do that.
What's a jury? A jury is the definition of a public body. It is literally a body of the public.
No, I understand that. I think there's where the human side of this, for me, if I'm honest, is what it comes down to, and I don't want it to be forgotten. Is that I don't think it is right what that officer has been put through, because it is not the same as a member of the public, and they do volunteer.
But it has to be higher. I could just about see an argument for saying when a police officer kills somebody, it has to be an even higher system of scrutiny than a member of the public faces. But I wouldn't say that because I'm happy or not happy. I'm comfortable with them facing the same process that anybody else would face. Let me run you through this, and you tell me. You pause me when you think that this point here loses salience. There is no doubt that the police officer shot him. As with self-defense cases, it should be proven that it involved reasonable force. I failed to see what's controversial. A killing occurred. Deciding whether it was lawful or not should not be in the realm of the police.
Yeah, no, like I say, I think I agree with the principle. I think, though, that that the ultimate factor, the fact that police officers, or these, especially police officers that carry firearms, are doing so there's so much more to it than just a case where a person ends up shooting someone else. And I just think that has to put different.
I'm glad you rang in because up until this point, there was a broad consensus among serving and ex-police officers that what has been seen to be done is the best of all available options. And just with my, lightheartedly, Will, I have to tell you, Michael speaks for a few of my texters when he writes, "What on earth is this police officer talking about?" And Marita says he's trying to say that police officers are above the people that they police. I'm sure that wasn't your intention, but that is how you've come across.
So I just think that it's very difficult when a person's put out to do that kind of work and it's confronted with a situation where they have a firearm and they're confronted with.
But then why is the jury inadequate to make that decision in this case, but perfectly adequate in all other cases of killings?
I think that
because a police officer who has no faith in trial by jury is a new one on me.
No, I think trial by jury is. I think you're right in the sense that it is the best that we have.
You keep saying that, and then you keep saying but. So what's wrong with trial by? What's wrong with?
I think you're right that the outcome is the best we can hope for. I just wonder whether we could do something better. That maybe has less of an impact on officers who do that kind of work.
But everybody who faces trial and gets acquitted would be deserving of that extension of sympathy. That's the nature of a trial.
Not everyone I don't think it's the same as a civilian who doesn't carry a firearm. I mean,
people are wrongly accused of rape and their names are in the paper. People are wrongly accused of child abuse and their names are in the paper. The idea that because he's a copper, he deserves a different system or a different. That sounds pretty scary. The more I think about it, mate.
No, I don't think when you're dealing with organised criminal networks.
Well, they didn't know they were dealing with an organised criminal network. They were dealing with a car.
No, but what I mean is, if you're talking about the naming, you were talking about the naming of people.
Okay. Well, again, I can only read you what the judge said in that case, which is contradicting the point that you're making. But anyway, as I said, I needed to speak to a police officer who didn't welcome the passage of events as we have seen them. And although you broadly did, the idea that there's a better system, but it goes to a different school, is one that probably needs a little bit more work. Utter nonsense, writes Casey. The police officers should not face a criminal prosecution. This officer is completely correct. And Karen says the policeman was doing his job. That's the difference. The difference between what? 1 minute after 12 is the time. Change of pace, I suspect, after this, but what it will be, you'll have to tune in to find out. 5 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I think we'll continue with this conversation. A, because it's a very big story, and B, because I think, largely thanks to you, we've managed to really move into some fascinating territory. And I don't give the last caller too hard a time on the text. I think the suggestion that what has happened is suboptimal carries a little bit of weight. Why did the officer's name have to be released? The answer is because that's what happens in murder trials. And I think, if I've understood it correctly, the only circumstances in which you wouldn't release the officer's identity is if there were credible threats to his or his family's safety, which is precisely why the judge took the measure of explaining that there weren't, and will take 3 months to put in place mitigating measures to double-check that, belt and braces. So I think the argument then becomes police officers shouldn't be treated the same. If I am at work, and this is where you just don't know. This is where we can only talk to people who've done this for a living. But wouldn't we say the same about soldiers in some circumstances? I'm so worried about court-martials or a war crimes trial that I'm not going to shoot that enemy combatant over there. I think in that moment, all of your training prepares you for the split-second decision. I don't know that the voice ever is audible saying, oh, I don't know about this. Because if you're saying, oh, I don't know about this one, then you shouldn't pull the trigger. So when you pull the trigger, are you consciously or subconsciously confident that you are not breaking the law? You can't always go on trial. It only goes to trial if the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, thinks that there are grounds for trial. So there'll be plenty of circumstances in which a police officer shoots a criminal that nobody thinks for a minute should go to trial. And that's why I wonder whether, in some ways, and I didn't, I'm sorry, I know I said there was going to be a change of pace, V. You're quite right. I've changed my mind in the news. That's the great benefit of never having any scripts or notes when I turn up for work at 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm not married to anything, no guests booked, although we have got a fascinating investigation and report into circumstances in a British prison that I will be sharing with you before Sheila arrives at 1 o'clock today. Don't let me forget that, whatever you have to do. That idea of the policeman's job, his profession being pertinent to whether or not his identity being released or not, I can see a little bit of mileage in that. Here it is. Ian says, who would want to be a firearms officer now, knowing you will go on trial if you shoot someone? No, that's not the case, Ian. Although that speaks directly to where I'm steering the conversation next. Who would want to be a firearms officer now, knowing you will go on trial if there is reasonable doubt that you shot someone lawfully? Well, the short answer to that, mate, is I don't want anybody in the police who is put off by the idea of being investigated if there is a reasonable doubt that they shot someone lawfully. And that's what a trial does. It removes the reasonable doubt. And Sergeant Martin Blake has been found by a jury of his peers to have shot someone entirely lawfully. Entirely lawfully. And that intrigues me because, of course, the other thing is that you don't want anybody in the army, you don't want anybody in the military to be exempt from scrutiny. Or, well, I guess Robert Jenrick possibly does. But generally speaking, you don't want opt-outs from laws, opt-out from... I don't know. I mean, there's a lot going on here, isn't there? 9 minutes after 12 is the time. Robert Jenrick would probably argue he was doing the opposite. We can pull out of the European Court of Human Rights so that British soldiers... I don't know. It's so hard to keep up, isn't it? But I'm staying with this because I want to move it next to that argument. I've got a habit, you may have noticed over the years. I can sometimes be a bit dismissive of things I don't agree with. So I'd like to explore a little further the idea that we should be more concerned about the welfare of firearms officers and the attractiveness of the job. It's not a job I'd ever do. It's not a job you'd ever do. But can you really say that knowing you would be subject to the criminal justice system if you shot somebody would put you off doing a job where you might be called upon to shoot somebody? Because again, I'm building castles in the air a bit, but that's terrifying, right? This is why I found towards the end of my conversation with the last caller before the news, I found myself a little bit disturbed. Calling for something like a court-martial system I could probably live with, but I don't think we should do that. But if you took it even further, then you are saying that you don't want people to worry when they're deciding in the moment. You don't want anybody who might be required to shoot a civilian to be worried about prosecution. Otherwise, they won't shoot any civilians. I don't think I buy that, but I think it's worth exploring a little further. Cleland's in Bangor, Northern Ireland. Cleland, what would you like to say?
Good afternoon, James.
Hello.
Well, I'm coming from the point of view of I served for 37 years in two different police services, both of which were armed, and I spent my last 10 years as a detective inspector within the Professional Standards Department of the Police Service of Northern Ireland. So
you're pretty well qualified. Normally, I don't know how often you listen to the programme, I'd play what's called a Ray Liotta at this point because your qualifications for contributing to this conversation are incredible, but I think the subject matter is too serious to indulge in such silliness. So I'll just mark that and move on. Cleland, what do you want to say?
So I'm only familiar in detail with the accountability mechanisms for policing in Northern Ireland, but sure. I know that the Metropolitan Police it's reflected there in terms of we have a police ombudsman, they have the IOPC. And I think it's very, very, very important that public confidence is maintained in that police are indeed held to a higher standard than your ordinary civilian. Yes. Because the office of constable brings with it lots of extra powers. I can come into your house if you don't want to. I can take your stuff. I can deny you of your liberty. And in extreme cases, I can end your life. Now, I have to say that in this case that we're talking about, I have to say that Sergeant Blake is a hero.
Yes.
He took a life-changing decision, both for Mr. Kaba and for himself. And he's been subject to criminal prosecution, and he's been found not guilty. So one of the things that you were saying earlier on was about the police marking their own homework. But if my understanding is correct, in every use of lethal force, the Metropolitan Police must make a mandatory referral to the IOPC,
yes,
which is the independent investigative agency, who will, if they feel it's required, refer a file to the CPS for a prosecutorial decision. Now, if they don't, there is another, you used the words court-martial, but there is another structure that holds police officers to account, and there's a set of conduct regulations. So those conduct regulations allow for the police service to deal with, now in England and Wales, you have independent chairs. So the board that decides how to deal with an officer is chaired by not a member of the police service, usually a retired professional person. A lot of retired solicitors occupy those positions. So there's a secondary level, not criminal level of accountability that exists, and they dismiss officers all of the time. If Sergeant Blake had been found guilty in this case, the next thing that would have happened to him would have been the initiation of conduct proceedings,
yes,
and he would probably have been dismissed from the police service. So in this case, he was found not guilty. So
that's not quite the same as saying that the killing was lawful. I think I may, in strictly legal terms, I may have slightly misspoken a moment ago, but I'm splitting my own hairs here, Cleland, not yours. Oh, I think the phone line has dropped off. Can we try and get him back? Because I just want to run a couple of things by him at the if I can. Should we take a little break and then hopefully speak to Cleland after this? 60 minutes after 12 is the time. So, former firearms officer and then professional standards in the police, Cleland, who just dropped off the line a moment ago.
I'm back.
I know you are. I'm back like a renegade master. So if I've understood you correctly, you've reminded us, of course, that not every incident of a police officer using lethal force is going to go to trial, but things could not really have been expected to go differently, better in this case.
Just a clarification.
Yeah.
I was not what's called an authorised firearms officer.
Okay.
I served in two police services who were routinely armed.
Okay. Yes.
Unfortunately, in my career, I only had to point my firearm at one person, but fortunately, I never had to press the trigger.
Mm-hmm.
And I count myself extremely fortunate for that.
Again, that's such an important contribution because, that's the point, isn't it, about that type of work, is that nobody, I mean, you might have a few gung-ho characters, but generally speaking, it's the last thing you want to do when you go to work in the morning is actually discharge your firearm. But for people who say that police officers should have a different dimension when these sort of cases come up, what do you say to them?
So, as I said previously, there are non-criminal accountability mechanisms, and there are external to the police service independent accountability mechanisms, such as the IOPC. So you have to either trust the existing criminal justice and accountability mechanisms or not. And I guess some people approach this matter if they're involved in terms of they know the person who has been killed by the police. They love that person. That person was someone in their lives. Then they can't really come at this in a dispassionate, objective way. They're always going to be subjective. From their own point of view. But objectively, the United Kingdom has very high levels of accountability for police, especially in the terms of the use of lethal force, and very low, by international comparison, use of lethal force. Fortunately, the police service in the UK don't kill very many people. and that's a thing to be celebrated. And I think it must be due to the fact that the training, the standards that we impose upon officers who volunteer. Let's not forget that officers volunteer to do this kind of work. The processes that select them, that train them, are actually very, very rigorous. So we have a very high quality police service in terms of the officers who volunteer and then who we put our trust in to carry firearms. And sometimes, unfortunately, they have to use them.
They have to use them. And I suppose the subtext of that statement is, and if they didn't, ... And that's why the jury in this case perhaps took so little time to reach their conclusions. Cleland, thank you. A few people commenting on how lucky I am to have callers with your kind of background and knowledge, and I completely echo those thoughts. Were you a rubber healer? Is that the right phrase to use, or is that an offensive phrase?
A rubber healer. Well, my last 10 years I spent flying a desk.
Right.
I did some other operational work that I can't describe to you here, but
but that's the correct? But when you're doing professional standards, that's one of the terms that's used, isn't it? I've been reading a lot of Ian Rankin. I always love
one of the more polite ones. I have to say that my friend group within the police service didn't get bigger when I became a professional standards officer.
No, and I think that's why some of the literature in that field is so compelling, because and also of course the Jesus, Mary and the wee donkey stuff. What's that? That's professional standards as well, isn't it? What's it called? Well, yeah, line of duty. There we go. I bet you're sick to death of people bringing up line of duty, Cleland.
But the truth is, James, is that the reality of professional standards work is far more mundane and boring than is presented on the TV.
Yeah, I'm going to have to take your word for that. But obviously, those of us that enjoy the drama will still enjoy the drama. But I guess that's true of almost everything. Once it gets dramatised on the telly, it's going to be a heck of a lot more exciting. Someone should do a TV show about radio. I think they already have. Cleland, thank you, mate. Sorry, I'm jabbering a bit because that really was an extraordinary contribution. 21 minutes after 12 is the time. Mannix is in Wembley. Mannix, what would you like to say?
Afternoon, James.
Hello.
I probably want some advice from you, from my perspective, as a dad who's a black man, and I have 5 sons.
Okay.
Ranging from 42 to 30. Now, with this situation, for me, my point is, I think that the police officer should have been held to account, probably on a manslaughter point of view, just to hold him to account, because he was in line of duty when the situation happened. You know, he wasn't off duty or nothing like that. He was doing his job. And to me, I respect the police. I respect the judgment, because it's British law. Now, personally, for me now, I'm going to have a meeting with my 5 sons to talk about this situation. And if you ever buy a car privately, probably, because normally when you buy a company, they're HPI checked and so forth.
Yeah.
What to do if you're surrounded by police and they've got guns out? Not to panic and remember this case, because, you know, it's like a certain lineman.
What would you do?
What would I do?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm 63, James. I would freeze. I would sit still, and whatever commands are coming at me, I would do. Maybe very slowly, because I would be afraid. But I'd be moving very slowly and do what they said to do. So
isn't that what you tell your boys?
Yes, that is partly what I tell my boys. But I also tell them they're 9 times more likely to be tasered. And I know I'm 9 times more likely as a black father to make sure I've got funeral money than a white father who's got 5 sons, James.
And I've said a few times, and it sounds a little bit inadequate in the context of what you're describing, but I've said a few times today, 2 things can be true at the same time. Those things are true. So, you know, don't drive your car at police officers seems to be a fairly reliable piece of advice to give to anybody.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, and if I was going to imagine being in your shoes or your skin rather than mine, I would do what a lot of black people have told me over the years I've been doing this job, and I would remind my children that they live in an unfair system, a system that discriminates against them, and then therefore your children have to be more careful than my children do.
Exactly what I've been saying to them. And each incident that happens, because they're all driving, buying cars, and the younger two, they tend to want to go out to the club and stuff like that, and I really, really worry, because from my point of view, like I said, I believe anyone should be brought to account. I'm a van driver. If I knock someone over, it's going to either be questionable, reckless driving, killing with a weapon, which is a car.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
I do.
So there's this point of view. Even myself, I mean, my partner now is an English lady, and she always says to me every morning, make sure you take a breath, because you're going to face some things that I don't.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Just so we're not
It sounds to me that you're giving your sons the right advice, and I wish that we lived in a world where you didn't have to. But,
yes, and I've got
oddly,
10 grandchildren.
I want to say something. Hang on, I want to say this while it's in my mind, because it'll slip out. You know what it's like at our age.
Yeah.
I'll forget, because I wish I lived in a world where you didn't have to do these things. But what has happened to Chris Kaba has nothing to do with what you're talking about.
And that's why I've not commented on the Chris Kaba.
Well, you kind of have. You said that the officer should have faced manslaughter charges rather than murder charges.
Just like if I knock over a young child while I'm driving my white van, I should be brought to account first by my company and then by the police.
I don't like relitigating complex court cases, but I don't think a manslaughter charge when someone has deliberately shot someone in the head. I don't think a manslaughter charge.
The reason why. Can I tell you the reason why I stay there? All right, he should be held to account. So what charge would you put to a police officer?
He's not done anything wrong. You can't hold someone to account if they've not. You can scrutinise their actions.
James,
go on.
I'm just saying, James. Somebody died in this situation. So the person that caused the person to die, even if they're doing their job, should be held just to see if they follow proper police procedure.
He did.
It wasn't any negligence.
That's what the whole case was about.
That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. So the case came across, and I'm not in any way, shape, or form disagreeing with any judgment. I don't know the young man. I don't know his background.
You know more than you did. You know more than you did when the jury made its decision. We all do, and that shouldn't change our views.
Most of us know is we saw a few clips on the news or whatever. Yep. So my thing is now, what should I tell my sons and my grandson? I've got 3 grandsons.
Yeah.
And I've got to educate them in every situation, because just like one of your callers said, he bought a car or rented a car and found himself in a situation where armed police. Now, when he opened his door and they said, police, what? If he had panicked and slammed the door, it could have been a totally different situation.
These are two conversations. I understand why you've called me today.
I need to reiterate to my children.
Yes, you do.
And keep reiterating to my children
that
you are 9 times more likely to be in one of these situations. Now, there was a caller that called up earlier and she was trying to explain something, and there was a police officer saying you watch too much Hollywood. Now, my other reference will be I watch, when you real-time cops programs, the British cops, and they're chasing people and stuff like that. You see similar situations like that have a different outcome. Now, what would the reasons be? It could be there was no the car wasn't involved in an armed situation the night before. Do you know what I mean? But you do see situations like that where the car is blocked in, the young man's trying to get away, and they end up smashing the window or tasering the person, and the person.
I hear you, and I think
comes that way.
Listen, I'll tell you why you've rung me, or I'll tell you what I'm hearing, and this is the difference between you and me. And when you see a story like this one, you see your sons, even though they are law-abiding and innocent men. You see them, And you know,
in a sense,
no, only in a sense, because that all they have in common with Chris Kaba is their ethnicity and in some of their cases their age, and it therefore reminds you that they will be treated differently.
And what they don't have in common, I hasten to add, they're not in gangs. So
no, exactly that. I understand that. I know that, but I'm glad you've reiterated it. And it reminds you that they will find themselves in situations where their treatment at the hand of society in general, or the police in particular, will be different from how they would be treated if they were white. It reminds you of that. Of course.
But how would that make you feel if you were dad in my position? I know you have two children.
I'll tell you exactly how it would make me feel. I'll tell you exactly how it would make me feel. It would make me feel exactly like you do.
Right. Okay.
And I would do what you do. And I still would sometimes wake in the night worrying that the names that we both know, that list is going to get longer. Whether it is victims of race crime committed by civilians or whether it's victims of racial discrimination.
I kind of would like to hope that my 3 grandsons, which are all under 4, wouldn't have to face a situation like that.
So would I.
That where their father, who's my descendant, has to keep having the same conversations with them that I'm having with their fathers.
I know.
No,
I do. I'm glad you rang today. I hear that, and it's not
the
fair.
Sentiment I was ringing with. I didn't want to say this or that.
I know.
It's just my sentiment, and I uphold British law, and I believe in law and order.
Yeah.
But you have to understand that a person like myself is 9 times more likely to need funeral money for my 5 sons than someone like yourself.
Yes, I do understand that. And to answer the most important question I think you asked me is that if it was the other way around, I'd feel exactly how you feel. And as we've both acknowledged...
funeral money, James, as well.
Say again?
You'd probably save some funeral money just in case as well.
Yeah, and that is why I've enjoyed talking to you, and it's also why at the end of the conversation...
I've listened to you for years, but I've never called in. I'm a white van driver, and most of my vocabulary and dictionary, because my missus is an English teacher, when I go home and I say, like, that's reprehensible, darling. I said, well, where'd you get that word from? I said, James, I'm brilliant.
Thank you, Manik. Seriously. And stay safe, yeah? Look after yourself. And I mean, in short, the advice that you asked at the very beginning of the programme would be just keep on doing what you're doing. Oh, boy. It's 12:31. Jenny Barsby has your headlines. It is 12:34. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Here's something a little bit different, very much of a theme with what we've been discussing so far on the programme. I know I haven't given you an answer to that question, to that missing word round. It's not quite as unbelievable as yesterday's. Yesterday's was something like 3,724 AD would be the year in which all lead pipes had finally been replaced, but it's not a million miles away. Braverman sent files to private email how many times? Blank times. How much longer can we do the cauliflower joke when we're doing the missing word? Do I have to explain it every time we do it, or does it become one of those things like a sort of members? It becomes like a members bonus, something that only the hardcore listenership will get. Anyway, I'm not explaining it again. You'll have to. I don't even know what you'd listen back to. Last time we did a missing word round, or the time before last. Braverman sent files to private email blank times. How many times do you think, in a potential breach of the ministerial code, the former, I know, still have to read it twice, the former Home Secretary sent stuff to her private email account that could have constituted a potential breach of the ministerial code. It took the Times newspaper a heck of a long time to get this, to get an answer to these questions, and I'll give you a clue, okay? No, I won't. I'll give you the details shortly. But first, as you know, a second group of inmates are being released today in order to relieve pressure on prisons. 10,000 were released under the Tories, although you won't see much mention of that in the kind of broadcast coverage that's parked cameras outside prison gates. But as we were saying earlier, the Labour government has also just launched a review of sentencing chaired by the former Conservative Lord Chancellor David Gauke. Part of his mission will be to prevent prisons from reaching full capacity again in the future. A key part of that will be assessing what can be done to stop offenders returning to prison. This programme has spoken exclusively to a whistleblower at HMP Wandsworth, and she tells us why she thinks rehabilitation is almost impossible inside one of England's most troubled prisons. LBC's Eleanor Walsh and our political correspondent Aggie Chambray have the story.
A second tranche of prisoners are being released today in an attempt to ease chronic overcrowding in the country's jails. Back in August, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer defended Labour's policy following a summer of violent disorder.
If we hadn't taken that difficult decision immediately, we wouldn't have been able to respond to the riots as we did. And if we don't take tough action across the board, we won't be able to fix the foundations of the country as we need.
The government has today launched a sentencing review, a core principle of which is to look at what can be done to reduce reoffending. Last month, the former Chief Inspector of Prisons, Nick Hardwick, told us this will be key in dealing with the overcrowding crisis.
What we should all be worried about is the prisons are not doing enough to try and change these men's behaviours and attitudes so they don't reoffend when they are released, and to properly supervise them to make sure they're behaving themselves after release.
We've spoken exclusively to Sarah, a whistleblower who has worked at HMP Wandsworth for nearly a decade. Sarah, that's not her real name, describes Wandsworth as a tinderbox, where staff shortages mean in a 24-hour period, men are typically let out of their cells only to eat and take medication.
They are like caged animals. Some of them are caged animals on drugs, some of them are caged animals who are psychotic, some of them are caged animals who are acutely mentally unwell. But the state of the mental health departments in these prisons is so lacking, they can only deal with acutely unwell and or psychotic patient prisoners.
Sarah has come forward because she thinks conditions at Wandsworth make rehabilitation extremely difficult. She says poorly trained, inexperienced staff aren't up to the job and are easily manipulated by the prison population.
A lot of prisoners I have come across will self-harm to get something, either time out of their cell because when they seriously self-harm they have to come to a treatment room, or they use it to get vapes, or they use it as a tool, a bargaining tool, usually between a landing officer who, because everyone's so new and poorly trained, they don't know how to cope with this. So the prisoner will self-harm and say, I need to speak to a governor, and then it'll be 8 o'clock at night. There is no governor. And then this carries on until it turns out that he actually just wants vapes, if they don't get what they want.
Sarah tells us she attends drug overdoses every day. Substances like the synthetic drug Spice are smuggled in by family and friends, or through prison staff. But it's not just drugs which are the cause for concern. Sarah says home-brewed alcohol, known as hooch, is another driver of serious violence.
They make it out of bread and fermented fruit, and sometimes if they can persuade via the threat of violence or money or other drugs to people who work in the kitchens to steal yeast, they make hooch. It is insanely strong. And then I've come across prisoners who have had to be taken out of their cell because of the violence they are having with each other. They may be two friends, they've drunk some hooch, they're battering 10 bells out of each other, or they're self-harming to the point where we have to go in and rescue them. And on one occasion, somebody has died. It's like them drinking 80% proof, 90% proof, not the 12.5 you get at the pub.
In August, £100 million was announced by the government to try and improve conditions inside Wandsworth. And in a statement, the Ministry of Justice said, we are taking action to get a grip on the situation across the prison system, ensuring safer conditions for everyone.
Aggie Chambray there, working with my producer, Eleanor Walsh, on a remarkable story that is simultaneously arresting and entirely believable, isn't it? The notion that you will go into prison and come out entirely unrehabilitated and arguably in more trouble than you were before you went in. 12:41 is the time. We'll return our attention now. I've got another Donald Trump classic for you as well coming up. But before that, I should tell you, Suella Braverman sent files to her private email on 127 separate occasions with at least 290 documents attached. The reason why ministers are banned from doing this sort of thing is because the authorities have no way then of knowing what happens to these documents after they've been transferred to your private email account. So 290 documents that were part of her ministerial business ending up in a space where the parliamentary authorities would be unable to track what she did with them subsequently. But that's why ministers are banned from sharing sensitive emails and documents about government business with their private accounts. Weak security provisions put them at greater risk of unauthorised access. So it's not only not being able to track what happens to them, but also, of course, they are more susceptible to bad actors. It took 18 months, this transparency battle, before a tribunal judge forced the current Attorney General's office to disclose details of Braverman's use of her private email account while in government. We don't know what was in them. We don't know whether any of the documents were sensitive or official, but because the Attorney General's office has not responded to request for a comment. Good work by the Times, this. And she did not respond to a request for comment, although I think she told Nick something this morning about her laptops. The Home Office did not respond for a request to a comment on whether she had forwarded documents to private emails while in post. She was, of course, sacked last year by Rishi Sunak after comments she made in a column for The Times condemning pro-Palestinian protests.
In the elemental surge, where thunder reigns supreme. The clash of wills, where lightning strikes with might, unyielding its course through darkness and through light. No beams of wit unfold in victory or defeat. Thunderous resolve fold in victory or defeat. Thunderous resolve in every heart, complete.
Yeah, hi James. It was right at the end of the last hour, and you had a caller that I think finished the hour for you, and you were saying to them, yes, but what would that be? And they were basically saying there was something missing out of the system, but they couldn't put their finger on what it was. I absolutely agree with everything you've been saying this hour. In fact, I sent you a text a bit earlier on saying that.
Oh, thank you.
But I've actually thought of this a lot. As you know, I've been doing media comment pretty much since I left the police, so for a number of years now, a big number of years now. And I regularly get told that I'm taking the side of, or used to when I was on social media, I'm not on X actively anymore. But I regularly got told that I was taking the side of the police. Now, you know, you would say that, wouldn't you? Yeah. You're one of them. I understand where that is coming from, and it's in the justice must be seen to be done part of the situation.
Yeah.
I know, because I've been subject to it, and I've been around it, and I've seen it happen to colleagues. I know that the test applied by the IOPC and the CPS is done properly and thoroughly, and if they decide there's insufficient evidence on their usual routine question, is there enough evidence to make a prosecution likely to succeed, realistic prospect of a conviction, and is it in the public interest? When they apply those questions, they are applying in exactly the same way, with exactly the same care and thoroughness as they do in any other case. And therefore, the police officers are being treated just like anybody else.
Except on public interest, Peter. Public interest would be different in a case like this than it would be in a...
It would.
But again, it's something that they have to weigh up, which I think that's where I was coming from at 11 o'clock this morning, in that public interest is served by a trial, even if it feels, in some ways, it feels unfair on the officer concerned.
Yeah, but we've got two things here. We've either got a behind closed doors, for want of a better description.
Yeah, no one wants that.
Decision made by the IOPC and CPS.
Yeah.
Which, as well as being behind closed doors, means that the witnesses aren't tested. Their account is given in an interview if they're suspected of something to those IOPC investigators, but then that tape, that record of the interview, is not tested again in any sort of open forum like it would be in cross-examination.
And that's
of
unsatisfying, and that's not in the public interest,
It
and it's
is.
not transparent. So what are you suggesting as the alternative? Because that's where Will fell down. That's why the caller you're referring to fell down.
Indeed. What I've thought is that we need to go back to the future a little bit. If you go way back when in the criminal justice system,
Yeah.
you used to have grand juries. They still do in America. And those grand juries hear the evidence and decide whether to send to trial.
Like, you mean like professional jurors, almost?
No, these are actually drawn from the population.
Oh, are they? Oh, forgive me.
I'm not an expert on the American system,
Sure.
but I believe they are.
But why
actually
do we need that?
members of the public.
I'm short of time, but so why do we need that as opposed to what's just
Because
happened? What?
What I would suggest.
Yeah,
is
what would
the
it
CPS
improve?
and
What would it
IOPC
improve?
Make the decision now,
Yeah.
but then that decision is subject to a grand jury hearing, whereby the evidence is heard in public. There is the opportunity for cross-examination, and the families of interested parties could be represented. It is subject to that cross-examination. It's all done in public, and then that jury decides, was the CPS IOPC decision
so they
not
make
to
a
send
decision
to
on
trial
whether it
correct?
goes to trial.
And they have some degree of ability, and it could be constrained in some way, but they have some degree of ability to say, no, we think this should go to full trial. But it would also be able to have something put on it that says once that's been done, if they have decided not to, it draws a line under
But
it.
you're
so
presuming
there'd be a downside for the police.
Yeah, and that again, it recognises the role that a jury plays in both transparency and public
Indeed.
interest, which some people are determined to miss. That
Indeed.
point, but you're presuming that this argument only kicks in because you believe that that in this case a grand jury probably wouldn't have sent this case to trial.
I don't know. I really
Well, then
don't
I don't
know.
understand why we need a grand jury. I don't understand what is unfit or in need of improvement in the context of the IOPC and the CPS.
Because it provides a public forum in which that decision is
But
is
so
made
does the
or
trials. I mean,
rubber-stamped.
so it's,
the trial is a lengthy thing that goes on for some time.
Okay.
The pro police bill, the positive thing for the police would be you could put a line under the proceedings at that point and say if they decide not, that's the end of the matter. You don't keep coming back to it time and time and time again, which we see with IOPC.
Okay. I mean, it's very interesting. Special prize, Peter, if you can tell me when grand juries were abolished in this country.
I am going to say 1897.
No, 1948 completely, partially in 1933, and then completely in 1948. But you're absolutely right; they might still exist in America, but they have their roots in medieval England. The development of common law being intrinsic, or rather, the grand jury being intrinsic to the development of common law. Thank you, mate. It's 12:49. It is 12:52. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. So a consensus, by no means a unanimous one, but the idea that it's good that the trial happened. I think Lou's line about I wish that all killings, particularly of black people by police officers in America, went through this process. Peter's contribution notwithstanding about the possibility of having a sort of extra level of scrutiny, public scrutiny in place. Jamie reminds us that grand juries in America aren't public. They are sealed. So I don't know whether that would fit the need for transparency or the need for openness. And one of the reasons why they were abolished is because they'd become perceived as just rubber stamping the wishes of the prosecution. 12:53 is the time. But the one bit I don't get is why he had to be named. I understand. Well, I mean, the media replied for his name, and the judge therefore has to make a decision about whether any damage would be done to the defendant by his name being made public. And the judge was confident that it wouldn't. But I obviously, with the caveat that his name would be shouted from the rooftops the minute a guilty verdict dropped. Personally, as someone who doesn't even claim to understand all of the conflicting factors in play here, personally, I don't know that he should have been named. And that depends upon how much damage it does to him, materially, emotionally, professionally. I think is probably unlikely. I imagine his colleagues regard him as a hero. And the more you read about Chris Kaba's record, the easier it is to share in that description, to share in that conclusion. But the knowledge of how much damage that the publication of the name does is the one area that I still think is for me at least, very, very grey. I'd say probably one more call, and then we're going to have a Donald Trump festival, because I'll tell you what, we paid quite a lot of attention to Joe Biden's apparent decline, but Donald Trump's is of a different order altogether. Bob's in Beverley. Bob, what would you like to say?
I originally called in, James, because I was a bit animated about the notion earlier in the programme that, or the contention that all shootings, or it sounded like all shootings, should be examined in the highest court in the land,
yes,
with the most serious charge on the books.
I think we could all agree that would be silly.
Yeah, but
if I'm going into an armed robbery or something like that, someone points a shotgun at me and I shoot them, I don't think anyone would argue that person should end up in court.
Yeah, I mean, you and I would have good beginnings of a self-defence case.
Exactly.
Imagine,
yeah.
Which the police officer is also entitled to, as it happens. But I think the basic problem is public trust, as we know. It has been, over the recent years, deserved or not, police have had relentless bad publicity, and many people would argue that is right, but nobody splashes the headline that police have done a great job, or 90,000 have done a great job this year.
That's the nature of news, Bob.
Yeah. The only thing I would contribute about what instead of trial by is something the Americans seem to do well, and I know it's a horrible business over there with police shooting people, or often seems to be the case, but they sometimes are very open with video and facts at early stages. I think if our police...
body cameras. So you're the second copper to say that. I think you're an ex-copper, aren't you? But and the line I used earlier was about technology somehow getting ahead of police management sometimes.
Very much. And the police senior management in my time, and almost certainly now, are conservative in what they say. Frightened, some would say, to be open for fear of criticism, perhaps for...
Well, that's why there's got to be certainty. That's why I quite like body camera footage, because, I mean, obviously footage can be edited and manipulated, but if the police are confident that it hasn't been, and it is coming from a camera worn by one of their officers, I could be persuaded that getting that into public discourse or getting that into the public space sooner rather than later would actually be would be progress rather than regress. Bob, thank you. I just want to squeeze in. What do you think Donald Trump is talking about here?
Arnold Palmer was all man, and I say that in all due respect to women, and I love women, but this is a guy that was all man. This man was strong and tough, and I refuse to say it, but when he took showers with the other pros, they came out of there, they said, oh my God, that's unbelievable. I had to say it. We have women that are highly sophisticated here, but they used to look at Arnold as a bad. But he was really something special. Arnold was something special. So I just want to tell you, you're very lucky, the people that live in Detroit, and it's an honor for me to be here because of him. And he was actually he was a great man. And I don't think there would be golf to the extent that you have it today. It probably wouldn't be that way without the great Arnold Palmer. So enjoy it, everybody. Enjoy it. And I had to tell you the shower part of it because it's true. What can I tell? We want to be honest. We want to be upfront. It's true.
That was a former and possibly future president of the United States of America expressing his admiration for Arnold Palmer's penis.
News just in.
It's the satirists I feel sorry for, She. Honestly.
It's crazy.
I wish I could qualify that somehow and say that's what he's doing. He's literally waxing lyrical about a golfer's 5-iron. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player. I've got a phone-in planned about what people who vote for Trump are actually voting for. It's a vibe. It's not a person, it's a vibe. But what is the vibe? That's coming in the coming days or weeks. But don't forget, on Global Player, you can pause and rewind live radio as well as listen to a range of podcasts. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick. But now it's Sheila Fogarty.
How am I supposed to follow that? By trying to enthuse people about water companies. Yes. I think we can do this.